The wind blew hard across the empty plains. Dust lifted from the dry earth, wrapping the little cabin in silence. Inside, a woman sat still, her hands folded over her lap. Her face was pale, her lips dry. For 5 long days, no food had touched their mouths. Her children lay beside her, too tired to cry anymore. Hunger doesn't scream when it's deep enough, it whispers. She looked out through the cracked window and saw the sun melting into the horizon. The light was soft, golden, and cruel at the same time. She had once believed mornings meant hope. Now, each sunrise only brought another day of emptiness. Her husband was gone, buried in the same soil they once worked together. The farm had turned to dust after the drought. The neighbors were gone too. She had no one left to ask. That evening she made a decision. Weak legs trembled as she stood up, wrapping a torn shawl around her shoulders. She took her children by the hand. Their steps were slow, dragging through the dirt road that led to a ranch she had passed only once before. People said the man who lived there didn't talk much. Some called him cold. Others said he preferred animals to people. But right then she didn't care about stories. She only cared about bread. By the time they reached the gate, night had fallen. The stars looked close enough to touch, but none of them gave warmth. The woman hesitated, her breath shallow. Her pride screamed for her to turn back, but her stomach twisted in pain, and she felt her daughter stumble beside her. So she lifted her hand and knocked once. The door opened slowly. A tall man stood there, a lantern in his hand, his eyes sharp but calm. The smell of baked bread drifted out, heavy and sweet. The woman swallowed hard, her voice almost gone. "We haven't eaten in 5 days," she whispered. The rancher didn't answer. The only sound was the soft creak of the lantern swinging in his hand. For a long moment they just looked at each other, two strangers standing in the middle of silence, one with everything to give, the other with nothing left to lose. The man's gaze lingered on her face, reading the lines carved by hunger and grief. The lantern light flickered across her hollow cheeks, making the shadows beneath her eyes look deeper. For a moment he said nothing. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. The smell of bread filled the cold air again, drawing the children's weak eyes toward it. She hesitated, clutching her shawl tighter. Pride still whispered, "Don't step in." But desperation was louder now. She nodded softly and guided her children inside. The warmth of the room felt almost painful after the chill outside. Her youngest boy blinked at the fire burning in the hearth, its glow painting the walls in amber light. A simple table stood nearby, a loaf of bread resting on a wooden board. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had seen in days. The rancher closed the door behind them and placed the lantern on the table. He watched her carefully, not with suspicion, but with quiet thought. She waited for him to speak, to ask who she was, what she wanted, why she was there. But he didn't. Instead, he picked up a knife, cut a thick slice of bread, and handed it to her. She froze for a second, the smell dizzying her. Then she tore off a small piece and handed it to her daughter first. The child bit into it like it was heaven itself. Her son followed, and finally she allowed herself one bite. It was soft, warm, and real. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she even knew they were coming. The bread wasn't just food, it was mercy. She tried to speak, to thank him, but her voice failed. The rancher looked away, almost uncomfortable with her tears. He moved to the counter and poured water from a jug into 3 cups. "Drink slow," he said quietly, his voice low and rough like gravel. It was the first thing he had said. She nodded, still trembling, and obeyed. The children sipped carefully, their small hands clutching the cups like treasures. Silence filled the cabin again, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This one had warmth in it, the kind that lives between people who don't yet understand each other but share the same ache inside. After a few minutes, she found her voice again. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "I thought maybe you could spare a little bread. I'll work for it. I can clean, cook, anything you need." He studied her as if weighing every word. "Name?" he asked simply. "Clara," she said. "My children Lily and Sam." He nodded slowly. "Elias," he said, tapping his chest once. "This is my ranch." She nodded back, unsure what else to say. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel both safe and uncertain. His face was worn, lined from years under the sun. He looked like a man who had lost things too, but learned not to show it. "I can't stay long," Clara added quickly, as if trying to protect him from her own troubles. "Just until the morning, we'll go after that." Elias turned toward the window where the night pressed dark against the glass. "It's a long walk back," he said. "You'll stay the night." The tone in his voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't harsh either. It was final, like a decision already made. Clara wanted to refuse out of pride, but the exhaustion in her bones left no room for argument. She nodded once and whispered, "Thank you." He motioned toward a small bed in the corner, one covered with a wool blanket. "You and the little ones take that. I'll sleep by the fire." She opened her mouth to protest again, but he was already moving, gathering more firewood. The crackle of the flames filled the space between them. Her children were already half asleep, full for the first time in days. She sat beside them, listening to the quiet rhythm of the fire and the soft sound of Elia's stacking wood. Outside, the wind howled across the open land, rattling the windows. Inside, warmth and weariness mixed into something heavy but calm. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt her guard loosen. She wasn't safe yet, but she wasn't lost either. Elias sat down by the fire after a while, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Your husband," her throat tightened. She hesitated, then said, "Gone. It's been almost a year. He didn't make it through the winter." Elias nodded once, not offering comfort, not asking more, just listening. Somehow that was enough. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken thoughts. Clara wanted to ask about him too. Why a man with a warm fire and fresh bread lived alone in a house built for more than one. But she didn't. Some things, she thought, reveal themselves only when they're ready. She looked around the cabin, sturdy walls, handmade furniture, everything neat and in its place. There were no photographs, no signs of family, only the smell of wood, earth, and quiet. Her eyes grew heavy as the fire crackled low. She lay down beside her children and pulled the blanket over them. Her last thought before sleep was not of hunger, but of the man who gave them bread without asking for anything in return. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the window, painting the floor in gold. Clara woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Elias was already up, working. She watched from the doorway as he led a horse out to the field, his movements slow and sure. There was a steadiness about him, a kind of peace that came from being alone too long. She felt something stir inside her, gratitude maybe, or curiosity. She wasn't sure. But for the first time in months, her heart didn't feel hollow. She stood quietly, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor, watching him until he turned and saw her. He nodded once, just a small gesture, but it was enough. She smiled faintly in return. The words she wanted to say stayed trapped behind her lips, but maybe they weren't needed. Sometimes kindness doesn't need to be spoken. It just lives quietly between people, waiting to grow into something neither of them expected. Elias came back inside after a while, his boots coated in dust, his shirt damp from the morning work. He moved around the small kitchen like it was a rhythm he'd known all his life. The slow scrape of a chair, the quiet clatter of tin cups, the soft hiss of the kettle on the stove. Clara watched him from the corner, unsure if she should speak or stay silent. She didn't want to feel like a burden. Yet, a part of her wanted to fill the still air with something, a thank you, a word, anything. When he finally looked her way, his eyes didn't carry judgment, just calm. "There's porridge," he said, motioning to the pot on the stove. "Not much, but it'll help." Clara's voice came out small, almost afraid of breaking the peace. "You've already done enough. I can't take more." Elias didn't answer right away. He poured the steaming porridge into 3 bowls and set them on the table. "You and the little ones need it more than I do." His tone wasn't sharp, just firm, like he was stating a fact. She wanted to refuse again, but Lily and Sam were already at the table, eyes wide with quiet excitement. Their spoons trembled as they lifted the first bites. Elias sat down too, not eating, just watching them. Clara finally gave in and took a spoonful. The warmth spread through her body, slow and steady, like it was waking up something she'd forgotten was still alive. For a long time, no one spoke. The sound of the spoon against the bowl was all there was, but it was enough. When the meal was over, Clara stood and began to clean up. She needed to move, to do something, to show she wasn't just taking. Elias didn't stop her this time. He just watched as she washed the bowls and wiped the table. When she turned, she found him leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "You said you'd work for food," he said quietly. She nodded quickly. "Yes, anything you need. I can help with cooking, laundry, cleaning." He shook his head before she could finish. "The ranch needs hands. I can pay you with food, maybe a place to stay until you find somewhere else." The words took her by surprise. A place to stay. She didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. "You don't even know me," she said softly. Elias shrugged. "I don't need to. I know what it's like to be hungry." Something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't pity. It was experience. A shared understanding that went deeper than words. She looked at him differently then, not as a man with everything, but as someone who had also lost more than most. Outside, the morning sun stretched across the land, touching the dry grass with a hint of gold. The air smelled of dust and hay. Elias grabbed his hat and opened the door. "Come," he said. "I'll show you what needs doing." Clara followed him out. The ranch was wide and quiet, with fences stretching toward the hills. Horses grazed near the stable, their tails swishing lazily. The barn door creaked as he opened it, revealing stacks of hay and tools lined neatly along the wall. It was a simple life, but it was steady, something Clara hadn't felt in a long time. Elias pointed to the water trough. "You can help clean and refill those. Keep the barn tidy. I'll handle the field." She nodded. "I can do that." Her hands were weak at first, trembling as she lifted the bucket. But the work felt good, real grounding. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders, drying the sweat that gathered on her skin. For a while, she forgot the ache in her heart. She just worked, and with each motion, she felt a little less like a stranger. Elias came by once or twice, checking on her without saying much. His presence was steady, quiet strength in the background. When she struggled with the heavy bucket, he took it from her without a word, poured the water, and handed it back. There was no lecture, no sigh, just simple help. By afternoon, her arms ached, but her spirit felt lighter. Lily and Sam played near the fence, laughing for the first time in days. Their laughter carried through the warm air, mixing with the distant sounds of horses and wind. Clara stopped for a moment and watched them. That sound, laughter, felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. When the sun began to fall, Elias returned with a small basket of eggs. "You can cook," he said, setting them on the counter inside the cabin. Clara smiled faintly. "Yes, my husband used to say my eggs could bring him back to life after a hard day." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Elias didn't smile, but his eyes softened just slightly. "Then let's see if that's true." She cooked quietly as the sky turned orange. The smell of warm food filled the cabin again. When the meal was ready, they ate together, 3 at one end of the table, 1 at the other. For a moment it almost felt like family. Afterward, Elias leaned back in his chair, looking into the fire. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Stay as long as you need, but don't thank me, just help where you can." Clara studied him, the firelight catching the faint scar that ran across his jaw. She wondered where it came from, what story it told. She wanted to ask but didn't. Some wounds didn't like to be spoken aloud. Instead, she said quietly, "You don't talk much." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Words don't fix fences," he said. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Clara sat by the window, watching the stars spread across the dark sky. She thought about Elias, his silence, his kindness, his loneliness. She wondered if he'd always lived this way, or if something had once broken him too. The ranch felt different now. Not just a shelter, but a place that hummed quietly with possibility. The kind that makes you afraid to hope, but too drawn in to stop. Clara didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But as she closed her eyes, she realized something had changed inside her. Hunger had brought her to his door, but something else, something wordless, was beginning to keep her there. The next few days moved like quiet chapters in a story neither of them expected to write. Morning light crept through the window before the rooster crowed, and Clara was already awake, helping Elias with the chores. There was no talk of payment, no promise beyond the day they were living. Yet each small act, fetching water, mending a tear in his shirt, feeding the chickens, wove her deeper into the rhythm of his world. Elias wasn't a man of many words. His silence spoke more than sentences could. He'd point toward a task and she'd nod. They worked side by side without need for conversation, but sometimes she caught his eyes on her, steady, unreadable, almost protective. When she asked about the land, he told her it had belonged to his father. When she asked about family, he simply said, "Not anymore." That was all, and somehow she understood without pressing further. One afternoon, while gathering eggs, Clara heard laughter, real laughter, from across the yard. Lily and Sam were chasing a small dog that had followed them from the barn. Elias stood nearby, his arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen his expression soften. For a second, the years that weighed on him seemed to lift. When Clara caught him looking, he cleared his throat and turned away. "They'll scare the hens," he muttered, though his voice didn't sound like he meant it. "They haven't laughed like that since before." Her voice trailed off, caught between gratitude and ache. Elias nodded once. "They should. Kids ought to laugh." The simplicity of his words struck her. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd believed something could be simple again. That night after supper, the children slept early. The fire burned low, the room lit by its slow flicker. Clara sat near it, sewing a small tear in Sam's shirt. Elias sat across from her, sharpening a knife, the steady scrape filling the quiet. "You keep busy," he said without looking up. "It helps me think," she replied. "About what?" She smiled faintly, her eyes on the thread. "About how we got here, about what comes next." Elias paused, his hands still. "You thinking of leaving?" Clara looked at him, surprised by the question. "No, I don't want to stay where I'm not wanted." He set the knife down slowly. "You're here, aren't you?" That was all he said, but something in the way he said it sank deep. The next morning, clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with rain. The ranch always grew quiet before a storm. Elias worked fast, tying down the gates, checking the horses. Clara followed him with buckets, trying to help where she could. The wind whipped through the fields and thunder cracked far off. When the rain finally came, it fell hard and wild. They ran for cover under the porch, both laughing breathlessly as the wind sprayed them with mist. It was the first sound of laughter between them, raw and unplanned. For a moment the world didn't feel cruel. Inside, as the storm raged, they sat by the fire again. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Clara poured coffee into 2 cups, her hands steady now. She was no longer the trembling woman who had knocked on his door. Elias stared into the flames. "Used to be I didn't like company," he said quietly. "Too many folks take and never give back." She waited, sensing there was more. He sighed, the sound rough. "My brother sold his share of the ranch and left, promised he'd send word, never did. After that I figured I was better off alone." Clara listened, not interrupting. She knew that kind of silence, the kind that grows roots. When he looked up, his eyes met hers. "But the house doesn't feel so empty now," he said, almost like he hadn't meant to speak the words aloud. She held his gaze, her heart catching on something she didn't dare name. "Then maybe it was never meant to stay empty." He didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth curved just slightly. Days turned into weeks. Clara and the children became part of the ranch's daily life. She woke early to prepare meals, worked the garden, and helped mend fences. Lily learned to feed the chickens. Sam carried wood for the fire. Elias showed them how to care for the horses, his rough voice softening each time they smiled. At night, Clara found herself watching him as he read by the fire. There was a calmness in him, a kind of steady patience she hadn't seen in years. He never spoke about feelings, never needed to. But sometimes, when she caught his glance across the table, something unspoken passed between them, something both tender and frightening. One evening, while hanging laundry under the fading sun, Clara heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Elias standing there, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this in town," he said, handing it to her. She unwrapped it carefully, a pair of worn boots just her size. Her old ones were torn at the heel. She looked up at him, words stuck in her throat. "I can't take these," she whispered. "They're yours now," he said simply. "You're part of this place." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not a guest, not a burden. Part of this place. That night when she tucked her children into bed, she lingered by their sides longer than usual. The ranch had started to feel like home, but a quiet fear stayed in the back of her mind, fear that it could all disappear again like before. Still, she held on to the moment. Outside, the sky was wide and silver with moonlight. Elias stood by the barn, the light touching his shoulders. Clara stepped out onto the porch, watching him. He didn't move for a while, just stared at the horizon. Maybe he sensed her there, or maybe it was the way the air changed when she came close. Either way, he turned, their eyes meeting through the dark. Neither spoke. There were no words big enough for what was quietly growing between them, something that wasn't quite love yet, but wasn't just gratitude either. It was the kind of connection that didn't need to be named. It simply was, taking root quietly in the space between a lonely man and a woman who had run out of places to go. Spring crept across the land quietly, painting color back into the fields that had been brown for too long. The grass grew in soft shades of green, and the air smelled of rain and life. For Clara, each sunrise began to feel less like survival and more like a kind of peace. She had stopped counting the days since she first knocked on Elia's door. They had fallen into a rhythm that made time disappear, each moment flowing into the next like the slow bend of a river. The children were stronger now. Their cheeks had color again, and laughter had found its way back into the small cabin. Sam followed Elias everywhere, asking endless questions about horses, fences, and tools. Lily spent her mornings beside Clara in the garden, planting seeds with tiny, hopeful hands. Sometimes Clara would pause, watching them through the sunlight, realizing that the ache that had once lived in her chest was quieter now. Elias was still a man of few words, but silence no longer felt like distance. It had turned into something familiar, almost comforting. They understood each other without speaking much. When Clara hung laundry in the wind, he'd steady the line without her asking. When he came in from the field covered in dust, she'd hand him a towel before he could reach for one. These small exchanges built something invisible but strong, like threads weaving a life between them. But peace has a way of drawing attention in small towns where gossip travels faster than rain. It began with glances at the market in town. Clara felt them before she heard the words, women whispering near the well, men tipping their hats with too much smirk behind the gesture. "That widow," they said, "living with the rancher now. Shameful, isn't it?" Some said she was after his land. Others said she'd trapped him with pity. Clara tried to ignore it, but the words clung to her skin like dust. Each trip to town became heavier. She began to walk with her head down, her heart thudding each time she overheard a laugh that might have been about her. She didn't tell Elias at first. She didn't want to stir trouble or seem ungrateful. But gossip has a way of finding cracks. It reached him one afternoon when he rode into town for supplies. Two men at the store spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "Rancher finally took a woman in, huh? Guess hunger ain't the only thing she's feeding." Their laughter was sharp, mean, the kind that hides behind drink and jealousy. Elias didn't respond right away. He just looked at them, long and quiet. That look was enough to drain the sound from their throats. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and when he left the store, the air around him felt heavier than before. When he returned home, Clara was kneeling by the garden, her hands deep in the soil. She looked up when she heard his steps and saw the storm in his eyes. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, but the word carried weight like a gate closing. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. You heard something, didn't you? He met her gaze then. People talk, they don't know what they're talking about. Clara's eyes fell to the ground. They don't need to, they only need to believe what they want. Elia stepped closer. You don't listen to them. Her voice cracked slightly. It's not that easy. You don't know what it's like to be the story everyone whispers about. He paused. You think I don't? Something in his tone made her look up again. His face was still calm, but his eyes told a different story. They talked when my father died, he said. Said I'd sell the ranch, said I couldn't run it alone. When my brother left, they said I'd lost everything. I stopped caring what they thought. I just worked. And when the noise faded, I was still standing. She wanted to believe him, but shame ran deep. I can't have Lily and Sam grow up being pointed at, she said quietly. Elia studied her, the muscles in his jaw flexing. Then maybe we give them something else to call you, Clara blinked. What do you mean? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn silver ring. It wasn't new or fancy, just simple and honest like everything about him. My mother's, he said. Been keeping it all these years. Never found a reason to give it away. Maybe I have one now, Clara's breath caught. Elia's, I'm not asking out of pity, he said, his voice low but certain. You belong here. You've made this place feel alive again. The children, they laugh like this land was made for them. You deserve more than whispers. You deserve a name that no one can twist. She stared at the ring, her hands trembling. The fire that had burned in her heart since the day she arrived flickered higher. She hadn't expected this. Not after all the years of loss, the cold nights, the hunger that had hollowed her out. She'd come to his door looking for bread, not for a future. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, he said softly. Tears filled her eyes. She hadn't cried since that first night, but now they came without shame. You don't even know how much this means. He reached out, taking her hand carefully like it might break. Maybe I do. The next morning, the sun rose brighter than usual. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers. The children ran through the yard, while Elias and Clara stood side by side near the porch. No ceremony, no words from a preacher, just a promise spoken in quiet certainty. She slipped the ring on her finger, the silver dull but beautiful against her skin. Elias looked at her the way a man looks at something he's finally found after searching too long. There was no grand declaration, no applause, no audience. Just the sound of wind moving through the grass and the steady beating of two hearts learning to trust again. Later that day, when Clara walked into town, she didn't lower her head. The same faces stared, the same whispers rose, but this time her steps didn't falter. The ring caught the sunlight, and for once she didn't feel small beneath it. Back at the ranch, Elias watched her from the fence line. She turned, caught his eye, and smiled. A small, certain smile that said everything without needing words. For the first time since his father's death, Elias felt that his home wasn't just land and fences anymore. It was laughter. It was warmth. It was her. The days that followed carried a different kind of quiet, one filled with warmth instead of fear. The ranch felt alive in ways it hadn't before. The smell of baked bread mixed with the scent of morning hay. The children's laughter rang through the open fields, and the echo of their voices reached even the farthest corners of the land. For Elias, it was a sound he hadn't known he missed. For Clara, it was proof that they had finally found a place where life could begin again. Elias worked the fields as he always had, but now there was something softer in his movements. He no longer moved through his days like a man passing time. There was purpose again, a quiet pride that came from knowing someone waited for him at home. Clara watched him from the porch sometimes, her hands busy with mending or shelling beans. He'd glance her way every so often, and though neither spoke, the look between them was its own language, steady, wordless, whole. The house, once a shell of silence, began to carry a hum of small joys. Lily sang to the chickens when she fed them. Sam carved little wooden toys with a dull knife Elias had given him. The evenings were filled with stories, with the crackle of fire, with laughter that didn't need to be loud to be real. Even the walls seemed to breathe easier. One afternoon, Clara stood by the stream at the edge of the property, washing clothes. The sun was low, the water glimmering like glass. She thought about how far she'd come from that night when her voice had barely risen above a whisper. "We haven't eaten in 5 days." It felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, she'd been running on nothing but hope, and now, somehow, she was standing still in peace. Elias came down the path carrying a basket of feed. "You've done too much today," he said, setting the basket down. She smiled faintly, wringing out a shirt. "I don't mind work. It keeps me grateful." He nodded, his eyes tracing the lines of her face for a moment too long. "You don't have to earn your place here anymore, Clara." "I know," she said softly, "but maybe I just like feeling useful." He stepped closer, the sunlight catching the edges of his hair. "You've been more than useful. You've given this place life again." The air between them felt different, heavier, but not uncomfortable. She looked up, and for a second the world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't the kind of love that comes fast or burns bright. It was quiet, like the earth after rain, deep, steady, real. That night after the children had fallen asleep, Elias sat by the fire while Clara finished her sewing. The room glowed softly with the warmth of the flames. He cleared his throat, his hands resting on his knees. "Town's quiet now," he said finally. "No more talk." Clara didn't look up. "You went there," he nodded. "Had to sell a few calves. Folks asked about you." She smiled without lifting her eyes. "And what did you tell them?" "That you're my wife," he said simply. Her needle froze mid-stitch. The word still sounded new when spoken out loud. Wife. It carried a weight she hadn't expected, a mixture of comfort and disbelief. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. Didn't realize how good it'd feel to say it. She looked at him then, and the small, genuine smile that reached her lips said more than words ever could. The following days passed quietly, each one blending into the next with a rhythm that felt right. The seasons shifted again. The wheat grew tall and golden, and Clara began to help with the harvest. She'd walk beside Elias in the field, her skirt brushing against the dry stalks, the sun warming her skin. When the day ended, they'd sit on the porch steps, the sky painted in orange and violet, their hands brushing just slightly as the world went still. One evening, as the first stars began to rise, Lily climbed onto Elias' lap. "Mama says you used to be sad," she said innocently. Elias chuckled, glancing at Clara. "Your mama talks too much." Lily frowned. "You're not sad now, are you?" He looked down at her, the corners of his eyes softening. "No, sweetheart, not anymore." Clara watched them quietly, her heart swelling in her chest. The sight of them together, this man who once lived in silence and her children who once lived in hunger, was a kind of grace she could never have imagined. As the night deepened, Elias carried Lily to bed, tucking her in gently. When he returned, he found Clara standing by the window, watching the moon rise. "You ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't come here that night?" he asked. She turned slowly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. "Sometimes," she said. "But then I remember I didn't find this place by chance. I think maybe we were meant to cross paths." He nodded. "Maybe we were both starving for something we didn't know how to ask for." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "And somehow, bread was enough to start it." Elias stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of the fire touched them both. His voice dropped low. "You know that loaf I gave you, it was the last one I had." Clara looked up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Then why'd you give it away?" He hesitated, then said, "Because you looked like someone who needed it more than I needed to be alone." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, rich with everything that didn't need to be spoken. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass. The sky stretched wide, endless and calm. Inside, the ranch glowed with the kind of peace that only grows from struggle and kindness. The woman who had once whispered out of hunger now spoke in laughter, and the man who had once guarded his solitude now found himself guarding something far more precious. The bread he'd given her had fed more than a body. It had restored a soul, and in return she had done the same for him.